Hello everybody, SlimKirby here, and I'm going on a long journey of trying to complete every single Game Boy Advance game in North America. This is the story of the highs, the lows, and all the silly stuff in between for the Game Boy Advance completion experience. This is GB Ace. Game number 38, Fire Pro Wrestling. Another wrestling game? So soon? That's interesting. We only had Ultimate Muscle about 9 games ago, and if you also want to technically include the 2 fighting games into the equation that we had, this makes our 4th fighting game for the challenge so far. Definitely the most common genre, aside from platforming, which, yeah, no surprise that that's the most common, since it's probably the easiest to base a game off of. But yeah, here we have Fire Pro Wrestling, released on June 11, 2001 in North America, and developed and published by Spike, with this particular region's installment being developed by BAM Entertainment, the same developers of that Kong game I played back as Game 7 for this challenge. Now, you may have realized, hey, didn't that date sound a little familiar? Well, yeah, it should have, because this was yet another launch title for the Game Boy Advance. Wow, we're not even 40 games into the challenge yet, and 10% of our coverage has been launch titles. And I wouldn't even say the system has a lot of launch titles to begin with either. We've just gotten that lucky, I guess. Anyway, believe it or not, Fire Pro Wrestling is actually quite a bit more than just a simple wrestling series on the Game Boy Advance. No, this series has actually had a bit of a legacy behind it. You just probably wouldn't have known that unless you did your research, because while this is just the first title of this series to make landfall in North America, this series has several titles that predate this, going back to old PC software and even a couple of titles on the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Sony PlayStation, and even one game on the Sega Saturn. But those games were unfortunately only released in Japan, so this was really our first and only exposure to this phenomenon at the time, with a slight exception to a game called HAL Wrestling on the Game Boy, which is considered a spin-off of sorts of this series. But what else is special about this game? Well, back in the day, wrestling games could only have specific licensing agreements with the various wrestling federations and leagues. So, as a result, the names and likenesses of specific wrestlers couldn't be used for a game like this. So, what did the developers do? Why, made a bunch of fake names and titles, of course, some of which should be eerily similar to names and titles you may recognize from the actual wrestling federation. For example, the wrestler named Steve Majors, the Bionic Man, is actually a play on Stone Cold Steve Austin, and the wrestler Brad Love is actually based off of Bret Hart. If you're a fan of wrestling, I'm sure it can actually be kind of fun to go through the list of names and see what the developers did to every single name that existed back then. So I'll try to remember to link that in the video description for some fun reading material for you guys. But yeah, as you can plainly see from this character selection screen, there are a lot of wrestlers in this game. Over 100 actually, so there are a lot of different names you can choose from. And you know what's interesting? Each of the characters feel fairly different from each other as well. I wouldn't say the gameplay is as varied as it is in something like Super Smash Bros., but still, you could pick one character, play with them for 10 minutes, and then switch to another character, and find yourself using slightly different moves and maneuvers to different degrees of effectiveness. And honestly, I think that's pretty cool, especially with a roster this huge. And what's even more, you can actually create your own wrestler as well, which adds even more customization options to the table. I didn't do this for the challenge, mainly because of the sheer number of options available, but still, I was really impressed by what I noticed here. And keep in mind, I am not a fan of wrestling, and more than that, I'm not really big on fighting games either, so giving this game kudos is probably a good sign right off the bat, right? Well, either that or I'm just cushioning the eventual blow. Which scenario is it though? Well, we should probably get into this game and find out. Before I get started though, I need to give a major thank you and shout out to Slice, one of the GBA challengers, and someone who is incredibly passionate about this game. I'll say it right now, I would have probably spent 500% longer on this game if it wasn't for his help and assistance in nudging me in the right direction in certain areas. because I'll say it right now, this game's weakest point and largest blunder is not explaining anything. Yeah, there is no tutorial or training mode, and trust me, this is a game that really needed one. Not really even because the game is cryptically difficult or anything, it's more that you have to play this game in a very specific manner. You can't just button mash or cheese your way to victory here. You need to learn how this game works and implement its fighting system in an effective manner, and with no direct representation or visualization, this game can have an incredibly steep learning curve. Now, I do believe the manual explains the system to some degree, but still, for something this technical and complex, I'd argue it needed something way more substantial than that. Heck, as bad as it was, Ultimate Muscle at least had a tutorial, and I didn't go into my first match feeling absolutely lost beyond belief, worlds beyond what happened in my very first match here. So after a few attempts and blunders and getting some instruction in the process, I was finally able to get the hang of things. Basically, this is how it works. You have 3 types of attacks: a weak attack with A normal attack with B, and a strong attack you do with both A and B together. In addition to these basics though, whenever you meet your opponent in a lock, if you press one of these buttons in addition to a D-pad direction, you will perform a special move that will do a certain amount of damage and potentially knock them down in an opportunity for you to do even more damage. You have to do this as soon as the lock starts, and the wrestlers make contact though. Otherwise, your opponent may get priority and attack first, or counter your missed input. You have to use your attack strategically though, as if you try doing strong attacks out of the gate, you will be countered easily, as they will still have plenty of stamina and be able to react to your moves efficiently. So you have to start out by doing weaker maneuvers as you build up to the stronger ones. You can also run around the arena with the R button and perform dash attacks, and most importantly, use the L button to breathe. Now, I know that might seem like a weird functionality, but believe me, breathing is important, because the longer a match goes on and the more you take damage and try to perform moves, your wrestler will get tired and be unable to react accordingly to certain maneuvers performed by your opponents. And if you get too tired, you just won't be able to move at all. To counteract this, while there is a lull in the match, make sure you walk around while using the breathing button just so you can keep your fighter fresh and prevent them from getting absolutely wailed on later. There's also a system for countering and defense, but I admittedly wasn't 100% sure on how to efficiently do that stuff. I'm sure it all depends on precise timing and input control, which is already not my strong suit when it comes to these types of games. But I'm certain it exists and is another strong strategic element of this title. I just had a very specific limit in my brain for what I wanted to take in without getting overwhelmed. So I spent a little less time on that and just hoped that I could somehow button mash my way out of these moments. I did discover that mashing left and right on the D-pad when you're getting pinned is a pretty reliable way to break out of that though. So maybe something to keep in mind, I guess. Which, by the way, since I know this is a common trouble spot in a lot of these wrestling games, pinning people down is basically the A and B combo maneuver when the other wrestler is down and on his back. So be sure to keep that in mind. Okay, so back to the completion aspect of this game. What do we have to do to complete Fire Pro Wrestling? Well, it's interesting because if you look at the main menu, there are a lot of options here. Exhibition mode, tournament mode, league mode, a survival mode, a team mode. Damn, we don't need to complete all of these modes, do we? Well, usually with how it works in other sports games or competition games of this nature, it's more about finding the right mode, as some modes are treated more like extra variations or bonus games. Or in the case of sports games, there might be a shortened version of a whole season where it focuses on the final tournament as opposed to the entire league. For this challenge, this is going to probably vary by a lot, not just in terms of what the game offers, but also what I'm personally feeling. I'll try to make it fair though in terms of my coverage, but understand that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to cover everything either. Probably just the bare minimum that will access the credits, usually anyway. I tried tournament mode to start, as tournament usually seems pretty final when it comes to what would yield the credits, but thankfully that was not the case, because I lost my first match anyway, and apparently you can't actually skip matches you aren't playing in, so there'd be a lot of waiting around if this was what I had to do. Thankfully, Slice revealed to me that apparently the credits will be only displayed after beating one specific mode in question, and that is the audience mode, which is apparently pretty unique to this game and series. In this mode, you pick one of 6 different styles, and then you pick your wrestler, and once you do, you get put in kind of a tournament ladder of sorts, where you must compete against other wrestlers, and once all the matches are over, you must have met a certain threshold to move on, otherwise your game is over. One of these thresholds will usually be based on the number of wins, but the other stat is arguably more important, because as the name of this mode implies, we're actually playing to the audience here. Basically, depending on the style you pick, you'll need to do your matches in a very specific manner, because based on that style, your audience rating for each match will vary heavily. For example, in Showman, you want to do a lot of flashy moves and taunt your opponent a lot, and for the strong style, you have to make sure the match lasts a while to show off your endurance in addition to your strength. I tried strength to begin with, but admittedly this was when I was still trying to learn the game, so I didn't do too well at first. I eventually got recommended by Slice to do the Stoic style, since it's apparently the easiest as it simply just requires laying the smackdown on your opponents as much as possible, and that sounded good enough to me. For my wrestler, I ultimately landed on Yuki Sendo, for no particular reason I might add. I mean seriously, I had no idea who any of these guys were anyway, and even based on their real-life personas, I still would have been pretty much clueless, so it was literally just picking from a gumball machine as far as I was concerned. Apparently in real life, this wrestler was based on Yuki Kondo, though, for those who do know their international wrestling circuits. So let's hope he treats me well here. So starting off with level 1, the 2 conditions we have to meet are that we need to win 2 of our 3 fights, while also having an average of 60% audience approval. Sounds like that shouldn't be too hard, right? Well, thankfully we do have safety saves that we can use to our benefit. Basically, before each match, we can save our game, and if we end up getting a bad result or a match with a bad rating, we can at the very least reset and try for a better one. This will come in clutch for the later levels, but probably not for the same reason you're thinking of. Anyway, let's see how my first round matches went. My first match was against Hercules Otsuki, and after a critical hit about 5.5 minutes into the match, the dude went down and I won with an 87% approval rate. My second match against Senin Kinoshita, well, it actually had kind of a surprise result because I got critical hit this time, taking me out relatively early. Even earlier than my win from the last match, as a matter of fact. What's funny, the audience still apparently loved it though, giving it a 90% approval rate. But since I was still wet behind the ears, I didn't want to save this result, so I actually reloaded and tried again, just to be safe. And it had a fairly similar result to the first match in terms of duration, but a much lower audience rating at 72%, and no critical hit this time. The third match was against Katsuya Akai, and once again, fairly same process and result, heck with even a 72% again too, leading me to beating round 1 with an overall average audience rating of 77%, over the required value and more than enough wins as well. Now, before I continue, a few things to note about my general strategy here. Honestly, a good formula for winning is really just constantly and consistently winning grapples with your opponent, starting with weak moves, then after doing some damage, moving on to the normal moves, and then finally the strong moves after that. I pretty much set my progression to about 10 hits per attack tier before I moved on to the next powerful hit. This progression allows your opponent to lower their resistance to the stronger moves, while keeping you in a relatively fresh state and condition so that you don't fall into that same pattern yourself. It also kind of helps to do an extra attack or two while they're down, just to again do more damage to lower that reaction time. Repeating this process for every single match should in theory result in a guaranteed win every single time, barring some instances of luck and also the fact your opponents will get slightly tougher in later rounds. However, remember, winning is not the only thing you have to do here. Now the audience values, that is where the challenge is, my friends. Notice how in my first match I got close to 90%, but in my other 2 matches I just barely broke the 70% barrier. What was so different about those matches? Well, if you remember, I got a critical hit in that first match, and sure enough, the Stoic-style judges love critical hits. Basically, whenever you do a really strong attack, like an attack that is not only powerful, but one that also catches your opponent completely off guard, you have a chance to do a critical hit, which here basically means you pretty much win the match right then and there, and will get a huge boost in audience approval as a result. So aiming for that critical is honestly key here if you want an easy victory through this mode. It is still kind of luck-based though, so keep that in mind. Also, if you do get a critical hit, do not attack the opponent afterwards, because you can get disqualified for invoking further violence on literally a person who can't freaking move anymore. I guess the Fire Pro Wrestling Federation wants to prevent acts of homicide, intentional or not, which honestly very fair. This didn't actually happen to me in this mode in particular, but it did earlier during my strong style attempt, which again I was still trying to figure out how to play, so how was I supposed to know I won already? It's almost like that Simpsons joke. Yeah, you know the one.
Stop! Stop! He's already dead!
But yeah, I'll get more into the difficulty of the audience later, but the one other thing I wanted to address was that one match I ended up redoing. I ended up getting a 90% for that match, despite the fact that I actually lost, and even though I redid that match to be safe, it honestly would have been smarter to keep that result. Believe me, even though I lost, it did save that 90% as my audience score. Plus, I had a match to burn since I only had to win 2 of the 3 matches anyway, so yeah, that would have covered me regardless. I guess in my defense, I didn't want to chance having to redo anything, just because I've made it pretty clear that this type of game isn't my genre to begin with, and the less time on it would probably be for the best regardless, so I was just trying to avoid that more than anything, despite the fact that it probably didn't matter at the end of the day regardless. Still though, it is interesting how this ultimately plays out, and did honestly give me some things to think about in regards to the progression of this game, as those high audience scores were definitely a harder goal than the general win conditions, so sometimes maybe the loss could be worth it. Hard to say, but I definitely considered that route a few times, the route of securing some wins and then just kind of throwing the other matches just in the interest of getting a high score. I mean, if it works, why not exploit it, right? So, on to round 2. Not only do we have more fights to do, but we also have to get 3 wins this time, as well as secure an average of 70% for our audience rating. Yep, our buffer is certainly going to be a little smaller this time, that's for sure. Match 1 was against Ricardo Gabriel. I had a bit of trouble with this one because I kind of neglected my breathing throughout, so close to the end when we both should have been at the end of our ropes, the game would just not allow me to do any sort of action, giving my opponent ample time to put some damage on me. I was tired of the brutality and just reset and tried again. This match generally went better, but it did last a long time though, over 9 minutes in fact, which really lowered my audience score. It gave me a 69, which, you know, aside from being nice, is just under the threshold we need to get. But since the final rating is an average and not a goal for each individual match, we could at least keep it in the interest of just trying to do better in the consecutive fights. The next match was against the Great Panther, and this was a little more of what I was used to getting in the first round, taking another win at the 72% approval rating. Nobuhiro Kawamoto was next, and after a quick fight of less than 6 minutes, I secured my third and final win with a 75% audience rating. Sweet! All I had to do now was just stay around this rating threshold and I should be fine in theory. I didn't even have to win the matches if I could swing that. Fourth on this round was Cheetah Carl, and yeah, repeat the previous matches like clockwork, this time getting a flat 70% for this one. And finally, for this round's finale, we had Mitsuru Mizuki, and after laying the smackdown on him, I was greeted with another nice 69 to close out this round. Now, while it was risky to try and keep 2 scores that were under the required average, my other scores were at least good enough to raise the average a bit higher and give me access to the next level regardless. However, we do need to be careful about these thresholds though, because starting with level 3, that's right, more matches, more required wins, and an extra 10% increase in the average approval rating we need by the end of it. Yeah, this game does not want to make it easy for us with that approval rating, that's for sure, as now the goal is higher than any of the scores we got in round 2. So I desperately needed to figure something out here, or at least find some plan of attack to get through this. In other words, I picture a lot of saving and reloading in our future. Level 3 starts with a match with Masayuki Kajita, and I happen to get a bit lucky here when I managed to score a critical blow in just under 4 minutes, giving me a very quick win and a 90% approval rating. Great start, I must say. Match 2 was against Rick Stacy, and this one I ended up doing twice. Not because I lost, mind you, I still completed both within the 5 to 6 minute range, but my first attempt was a 70% score, which put me exactly at the average I needed to be at by the end of the level. And I didn't want to lose my good start so quickly, so I tried again and got a 77% on my second attempt. Which was also kind of weird because my second attempt was actually slower than my first, so no idea how they decided to score this one, to be honest. Opponent number 3 was Berm Sturm, and no, not that Sturm. Ended up with a 73% score here, which wasn't great, and that officially matched me with the cut line again. But I decided to keep going because at this point I figured I would just have to get lucky with critical hits in order to get scores above the threshold anyway. Match number 4 was against Mike Bear, and I ended up doing this match several times just because I could not get out of the 70s for my approval rating. It just seemed like no matter what I did, the audience just did not care for my strats, which really sucked, because I was honestly starting to have some fun with the gameplay here, but not knowing why I wasn't meeting the threshold was kind of discouraging, and the critical hits were not showing up either. After like 6 attempts, I finally got a run where a critical hit appeared, and it was about time too because my wrestler was on the verge of tiring out, along with my opponent. And after 8 minutes, what was my score? 97%? I mean, yeah, I got a critical hit, but this was like 3 minutes later into the match than my last one, yet I still got a 97 out of it? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Whatever. This will help my average at least, especially since we still have 4 matches to go. Nobuhisa Sanada was next. Heh, I wonder if he is any relation to Yukimura Sanada from the Samurai Warrior series. Probably not. Anyway, this was another poor couple of matches where I just could not get a result through the 70s for some reason. Until I got a critical hit, which I did after 4 attempts, and another 97% to boot. Match 6 was interesting because our opponent is, well, actually, it's ourselves. That's right, Yuki Sendo versus Yuki Sendo. How about that? Let's hope I don't lose track of myself in this exchange of fists and feet because, yeah, they really don't show much of a difference between the two. Anyway, after a really bad 66% showing, and then a match that ended with both bodies in a very awkward position, quite literally giving new meaning to the phrase, love thyself, I do get a 77%, which, while below 80, is at least close, and I have pretty strong buffer as it is, with the 3 90-plus scores that I got earlier, so I decided to take this result. Kazuki Makurata is next for match number 7, which I also end with another 77%. But after doing some math in my head, I feel pretty confident that even one more score in the 70s should give me the win overall in this level, as we are finally in the last match of the series. This one against Takashi Minamura. And this match actually takes place in a cage as well, which to me felt pretty final, like this would be the last match of the mode or something. So I gave this fight all I had. Despite only getting a 73% by the end of this, it was still enough to pass the mode overall, with a final score of 82%, officially clearing level 3. Well, good news and bad news, folks. Bad news is that wasn't the end of this, because level 4 was next. Oh boy, even more of this unpredictability. At the very least, though, the percentage requirement didn't increase this time, so we still had to get 80%. We just needed to win every match this time, but since I had already been doing that for all my matches already, that didn't really even seem like that much of an additional challenge anyway. Plus, there were only 7 matches this time and not 8, so at least it could be shorter, in theoretical terms anyway. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on this, just because at this point it became a pretty regular cycle of doing a match, hoping a critical hit would happen, and if not, reloading until it did. Unless I already had a match that was pretty good and decided to use a bit of my buffer zone. I did discover something important during this level though when I started doing dash attacks, particularly after running against the fighting ropes. These blows were pretty brutal and did actually land critical hits a few times as well, meaning I kinda wish I discovered these a lot sooner. Plus they just feel so satisfying to pull off too, my god. So here's the breakdown. I beat Boss Daken in round 1 with a 78%, Makoto Higaki in round 2 with an 81%, Andre F in round 3 with another 78%, a critical hit finisher in round 4 to give me a full 100% against Neverland Roche, a 74% against Akira Seba, but since I had that 100%, I really wasn't too worried about it. And then, for the final 2 matches of the round, a disappointing 72% against Hercules Alaven, and then, to close out the finale, another 100% critical hit during the championship bout with Nick Stacy. And after combining all those scores together, I was over the 80% requirement average, and Yuki Sendo officially became the overall champion, leading to the game credits and me accomplishing my completion goal for Fire Pro Wrestling. So yeah, despite not really knowing the exact process for what I was aiming for, and the fact that level 4 was supposedly the most difficult section, I funnily enough had the least amount of trouble with it. The dash attack definitely helped, if not for the additional point of damage, but also the 100% scores as well. Also, I believe Slice also told me during this section to try and avoid maneuvers that would pin your opponent to the ground, as Stoic quite literally wants you to just go ham until the opponents give up or can't move anymore. And pinning kind of slows that down, I guess. Whatever though, we accomplished our goal and I felt pretty damn good about it. Notice how I haven't said the trademark words yet to signify our victory over this game. Well, don't worry, I didn't add an additional requirement or anything, I just wanted to try out a few of the other game modes before I stopped playing. So I did a 2 vs 2 tag match featuring the likes of Great Panther and S Dolphin versus Deathhead and Diefinger. I was the Panther because, like I have said before in other videos for this series, Wildcats are cool, but also because for some reason I couldn't pick Sendo anymore. Not sure if he was only playable in the audience mode or something, but yeah, it was weird that I couldn't select him. Anyway, I accidentally set the time limit for this battle to be way too short, so it didn't actually complete and timed out at around the 10-minute mark in a draw. I think the Team Great Dolphin was doing okay though, at least in my eyes. I also decided to try a deathmatch battle inside the giant cage, using another one of the Panther characters. Apparently for this one, the cage fence is actually electrified, and if you send people into the cage, it does some major damage to them in the process when they get shocked. Pretty brutal stuff, actually. I unfortunately lost this match though. I guess my skills weren't as electrifying as the electric cage was. The final thing I decided to show off was the Battle Royale, and I do think the idea for this is pretty cool. Actually having 4 people in the ring at a time and just seeing who comes out on top being the overall victor. It's actually kind of cool how it works when you lock with multiple opponents, as it becomes a case where the slowest reacting fighter is the one that gets knocked away during those exchanges, so there can be a bit of strategy involved with how you approach these, where you can play passively and just join in on attacks to weaken the field, and once a fighter or two is gone, you could have a distinct stamina advantage over who is left. Pretty neat mindset, honestly. Once again though, I kinda borked with the settings, and I think I made it so the match just couldn't end, at least through normal pinning conditions. So when we were getting close to the 25-minute mark, I kinda just ringed out on purpose just to get things moving along. Now, I didn't do this next thing, but hopefully this footage speaks volumes for how extensive this feature is. But you can also create your own wrestler as well, and damn! The amount of customization you have here is insane. Pretty much every visual is available in some way, from general looks to even animations, and you can even customize your moves too, and keep in mind, there are a lot of characters here, so the move pool is pretty extensive as well. Definitely something I did not have the time to get into, but someone really into this genre, I could imagine having a lot of fun with this. But yeah, after all that, I think it was finally time to declare this a game complete. And let me just say, this was a very pleasant surprise and experience for me. Don't get me wrong, I'm still not really a fan of wrestling games or just fighting games in general, but I definitely see the appeal of this one. And I think that there is a series that does this genre well. Fire Pro Wrestling is probably that series you want to stick with, and I don't think I'm alone in saying that either. I think it's pretty well known that this brand has a lot of fans. I could tell from the number of people who came into my stream during this game to talk about how awesome it is and how this series was really, really cool. And I will admit, I did have some fun with this one. Now, with that being said, the lack of any sort of tutorial or direction was a bit concerning, and I think if I didn't have Slice to help coach me a little, this would have probably been a rough one to get through, so thankfully I did have some help with this one. It definitely avoided a repeat of the Tony Hawk experience from about 24 games ago. I also just think that as a Game Boy Advance launch title, this game really delivered in a way I just was not expecting it to. It has a lot of variety and replayability, it controls pretty well, looks reasonably solid for a GBA game, and the music, oh my god, the music! Okay, this might literally be one of the best soundtracks on the GBA system, and I am not joking when I say that. Even the main menu theme is a literal bop, and it seriously feels like every wrestler has their own unique theme whenever they enter the ring. I mean, I'm sure there are some themes that might be shared, but still, just from what I listened to, I seriously can't recall any repeats offhand. I will say though, Sindo's theme was kinda depressing, not gonna lie. It's almost like a funeral was about to start whenever he entered the ring, and with the way he kind of started assaulting his foes at the end of every match after it had already been called, maybe that is kind of appropriate now that I think about it. I guess I was kind of playing as the heel in this playthrough, huh? But yeah, this game was great, which I guess means it's as good as time to any to get the scoring for this one. For overall game quality, I'm giving this a 4 out of 5 easily. And believe me, there is a part of me that even toyed with the idea of putting this up to a 4.5, or maybe even just a straight up 5 in general. The amount of variety that this game offers is absolutely insane for not just a launch title, but even just a GBA game in general. And I have to give it props when I feel like it deserves it, even if it's not a genre I typically enjoy. However, not having any sort of tutorial or explanation of how this game works, I think is a very big miss. And even after I got through this, there were still some things I didn't quite understand that a little more transparency would have been appreciated, just so I could get on the right track a little more easily. And also, for those same reasons, I have to lower my personal enjoyment to a 3 out of 5. But take my word for it, I did want to give it more. I really did, but I can't lie that not having clear instruction is a rather big pet peeve of mine. And if I didn't have help, this would have probably taken hours and hours longer, and I would have been way more frustrated. Just being honest here. And finally, for difficulty, I'll stick with a 3.5. Again, for the reasons I just mentioned, and the fact that this game can also be pretty tough and unpredictable. There's a pretty big wall you have to climb for this one, but the fact that you can save and load to try fights again if you get a bad result does prevent it from at least being impossible, or at least close to impossible. So yeah, that was my adventure of playing through Fire Pro Wrestling, and hey, guess what? That's actually not it for this series on this system. Fire Pro Wrestling 2 for the Game Boy Advance also exists, which means we'll be back in the future for another crack at this series, in this challenge. Whenever we draw it, anyway. Remember, odds are still extremely low after all. But when we do get it, I have heard that we'll actually have a tutorial to work with, so maybe that'll help clear up any gaps that were left from this experience. One can only hope anyway. But yeah, let's take a look at the next game we'll be playing for this challenge. Okay guys, thank you for watching this summary, I really appreciate it. Don't forget to leave a comment and or like on the video, as those will really help me in these videos out. And stay tuned for future summaries of this series. If you also want to watch full playthroughs of these games for this challenge, check out the video description for a full playlist of everything that's been uploaded and exported so far. And if you're curious about what I'm playing right now for the challenge, be sure to stop by my Twitch channel to see what my current progress is. Just be warned, I'll be a lot further ahead of where we are for these summaries, so keep that in mind. This has been SlimKirby in the GBA series, and I'll talk to you fine people next time. Later, folks.